Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you all a little bit of background on plastics and microplastics and the work we're doing here in Reno to study this. I'm excited to get a chance to chat with you. My name is Monica Arienzo. I am an associate research professor at the Desert Research Institute in Reno. And today I'm going to give a background on plastics and plastic pollution. All right. So what are the common types of plastics? And let's go over some examples. So we define plastics as a synthetic solid material made up of polymers. And you may be familiar with these because there are many common types of plastics that you interact with every day. And you may identify these different types of plastics by those numbers. You may find those at the bottom of your plastic water bottle or something like that. And these numbers represent the different types of plastics. So, for example, this number one indicates polyethylene terephthalate or PET, which is a common type of plastic for plastic water bottles. Plastic type number two is HDPE, which is a thicker plastic bottle, for example, a detergent bottle. And so these different plastics that you interact with every day are actually different types of plastics in terms of their chemistry and then in terms of what they're used for. This is an example of showing two different types of plastics that have different chemical and physical properties. And here we are seeing one of those physical properties, which is that some of those plastics are floating, the white ones, and some of those plastics are sinking, the black ones. And so why I'm showing this to you is to bring home the fact that when we say the term plastic, we actually mean this is a type of plastics are kind of a very broad class of items we're talking about, and they have different physical and chemical properties. And this is an example of those physical properties that are different. One of the questions we often get is where do plastics come from? Plastics actually come from fossil fuels. So they come originally from things like crude oil that then get refined to form monomers that then get combined to form different types of plastics. This is a graph showing global plastic production every year. And so this is showing how many new plastics we make every year since 1950 to 2015. And what we see is that every year we make more and more plastics. And this is in part because of the growing demand of plastics, but also because of the fact that we don't recycle a lot of our plastics. And you may see some of these dips in this graph, and that's because of global events like the stock market crash of 2008 and the subsequent recession that occurred. What are macroplastics? So you'll hear me use this term, and what I mean by this is plastics that are bigger than 5 millimeters. And so these are the plastics you interact with every day. These are macroplastics. Here you can see a photo of a litter sorting event we went to in Tahoe, where we sorted litter that was collected from the bottom of Tahoe. And here you can see some examples of those macroplastics that were collected. You also hear me use the term microplastics, and microplastics are these small plastics. So these are plastic particles that are smaller than 5 millimeters or smaller than a pencil eraser, but bigger than 1 micron. And so 1 micron is a little bit smaller than the size of a bacteria. And so here you can see that when we say microplastics, we're talking about particles we can see with our naked eye, as well as particles we need a microscope to see. In this Petri dish here, you can see an example of different types of microplastics that we use as standards in our lab. So we have some that are different colors, and we have some that are different shapes. For example, we have some fibers here, as well as some fragments, and so on. And so why are we interested in studying plastics? That's because plastics can break down to form these smaller and smaller pieces of plastic. So we can go from those macroplastics, for example, a solo cup, that then breaks down to form these micro, and they can actually form particles that are so small that they're considered nanoplastics, or particles that are nanometer in size, which is essentially the size of a virus. So these are can get really, really, really small. We are also interested in studying plastics because these plastic items can absorb or release other chemicals. So, for example, one of the research questions we asked with our collaborators was to look at if um, if microplastics in the Truckee River can absorb or release mercury. So, for example, we know we have mercury in the Truckee River from the historic gold mining that occurred in the region. And so the question was, could mercury attach to a microplastic in the Truckee River and be transported to different parts of the Truckee River? Plastics can also be consumed by animals or they can become ensnared in them, and this can cause a false sense of fullness. So if an animal is eating lots of microplastics, they can then think that they are eating nutritious food and feel full, but actually they're full of plastics instead. And so this is a little meme to just bring that point home of all the plastics that are entering into our waterways and interacting with our aquatic species. And so ultimately, one of the reasons we are interested in studying plastics is because we do have concerns about the potential negative impacts to human and environmental health. This is not research my group focuses on. My group focuses on understanding where plastics are in the environment and how they got there. But this is something we always try to bear in mind in our research, is that our research is important for understanding the impacts to human and environmental health. And so this is a related little meme that I love, of saying that we all have a little Barbie in us, the microplastics, little funny little meme. Okay, so one of the questions that my group does try to focus on is understanding where are plastics coming from and going in the environment. And so to do this, we look for plastics all over the environment to try to understand if they were coming from there or if they were moving through the environment when we sample them. So this is a nice depiction showing some of the sources of plastics in the environment, some of the pathways or ways that they are transported, and then the fate or where they may end up in the environment. So, for example, in red here, we have different sources, which can include things like our plastic bottles, our bags, our textiles, and these can escape into the environment through humans leaving them in the environment, or through just natural, or through other processes, like when we wash our clothing, for example, that can actually release um, plastics into the environment because our clothes contain plastics. We can have the manufacturing plants that actually produce plastics, and those can also escape into the environment. And then other human activities like just driving can emit tire dust, which can then enter into the environment. And then lastly, we have other sources like landfills, as well as human activities like fishing. Those sources can then be transported through the environment through wind and rain, through agriculture and stormwater runoff, and through discharge from our wastewater treatment plants. So coming back to our clothing, when we wash our clothes, that water ends up in our wastewater treatment plant, and that water can contain particles from our clothing that may be plastic, and then they might not get treated or removed during the treatment process. Plastics can then ultimately end up in our sediments, so in the bottom of lakes, in the bottom of our rivers, in the ocean, or they can get ingested by animals. So now I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about the research that my group has been doing. In my group at DRI, we look at microplastics in water, and this is a photo here of a former master student, Hannah, sampling along the Truckee River to look for microplastics in our water. We also look for microplastics in snow. And so this is a photo of me sampling at a ski resort where we are looking to see if there are microplastics in the snow at the ski resort. And then, of course, we look at litter in the environment. So this is another photo from one of those times that we did an assessment of litter in our environment um, in Tahoe. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the work we've been doing looking at microplastics in the Truckee River. As I mentioned, this is work that my former master's student did. And so what we were interested in looking at is microplastics from the outlet of Lake Tahoe and all along the Truckee River as it crosses the town of Truckee, as it crosses Reno and Sparks, and when it ends up in Pyramid Lake. And so all along here, we measure the microplastic concentration. What did we find? We found that the amount of microplastics per liter of Truckee River water was lower in the fall of 2022 than it was in the spring of 2023. The other thing we found is that many of our plastics are these common single-use plastics, such as polyethylene terephthalate or PET that makes up our water bottles, and plastics like polypropylene and polyethylene. And these are very, very common plastics. So to wrap up, I now want to talk about what you can do to help reduce your microplastic footprint. And these are handouts that are available on our website, and I'll be sure to connect you guys with that if you're interested. But these are recommendations we have based on the science we do. So one of the big things we have been working on is understanding emissions of microplastics every time you wash your clothing. And what we find is that if you wash your synthetics less often and use high efficiency cycles and cold water, you won't emit as many microplastics in the environment. Additionally, every time you dry your clothes, that hot air that vents outside of your home does contain microplastics from your clothing. And so we recommend always making sure you clean out your link catchers in your dryer. And if you have the opportunity to look at ventless dryers, those may reduce microplastic emissions to the environment. We also recommend not to buy tea bags made of plastics. The studies have shown that those tea bags can emit microplastics into your tea, especially because of the hot water that you're pouring on that plastic tea bag. And then we recommend reducing your single-use plastic use. So things like using reusable mugs, reusable containers, forks, and so on. So I always have a metal fork in my desk drawer, so I can always bring that to a seminar or take it with me wherever so I don't have to use a single-use plastic item. In conclusion, plastic pollution is a concern for the environment and for humans. Although this isn't the work my group does, we study microplastics in the environment to better understand the sources and where they may be going in the environment. And we have found plastics in the Truckee River. And I didn't show this, but we have been looking all over the globe and we found microplastics there too. Our goal is that our data can help inform regional and global plastic pollution reduction efforts. And we really encourage continued education on this topic, which is why efforts like this green box are really important. And so with that, I will leave you with my email. You're welcome to email me if you have any questions. You can also go to our lab website right here, dri.edu/lab/microplastics. And you can find some handouts there about microplastics, including the ones I showed today. With that, thank you.